So I'm traveling to my friend's wedding and I brought a couple of PEPSI GMTs because I wanted to track 2 time zones. Or is it 3 time zones? How about 6 time zones? Hey guys, I'm Max and welcome back to Hot Ones. So I've always been intrigued by the very photogenic 5-digit Rolex GMT Masters. Now these watches have great history and are amongst the most iconic Rolex sports watches out there. But for that very reason, they've also achieved grail status for many and the prices have gone parabolic. Luckily, I was able to borrow one for a weekend trip down to the Northern California coast in Mendocino County. It was a wonderful trip and an amazing location, but I do realize that this is actually in the same time zone as where I live in Seattle. But come on, let's be frank. As beautiful as that GMT hand is, how many of us are actually aware of what it's pointing at on most days? The GMT Master is perhaps the prettiest Rolex I've held. This 16700 hails from the late 90s and represents the last hurrah for the GMT Master before moving on to the GMT Master 2. The PEPSI bezel derives its name from the combination of blue and red color scheme, and as these vintage aluminum bezels age, the red fades into this cotton candy pink that is oh so lovely. Compared with newer Rolexes with maxi dials, the white gold encased hour markers are smaller, leaving more negative space for the dial to breathe. This 5-digit GMT Master also has advancements including a sapphire crystal and a quickset date to make your life easier. But the GMT story starts in the early 50s when commercial air travel was just taking off. Pan Am Airlines at the time asked Rolex to develop a watch for their pilots, and this led to the conception of the reference 6542, with its signature GMT hand for tracking a second time zone, utilizing a bidirectional rotating bezel. The next evolution of the GMT Master was the 1675, featuring a larger 40mm case, up from 38, and crown guards. In the 1970s, we got some new colorways in the form of the root beer and the black bezel, both of which came on two-tone bracelets. In the 80s, the GMT Master 2 was introduced in the reference 16760, now with a decoupled GMT hand allowing you to track 3 separate time zones. In the modern day, we now have the 6-digit GMT Masters with ceramic two-tone bezels, which Rolex calls Cerachrome. But I feel that it is this generation of 5-digit watches that represent the epitome of pure Rolex sports watch. They're equipped with robust 3175 movements, but remain manageable in size. The 40mm width may sound hefty, but it's belied by its thin 12mm depth and a 47.5mm lug-to-lug. And then there's just the magic about the fit of a vintage Rolex you can't quite put your finger on. There's such presence on the wrist with the sharp contours of the bezel and the crown guards, and there's certainly no subtlety about the multitude of colors and shapes coming at you, but it's bold in a restrained way with nothing protruding where it shouldn't and with the watch easily tucking itself behind a cuff when you ask it to. However, one drawback of this time period is apparent through the bracelet. Though the Rolex Oyster is universally hailed and puts bracelets from Omega in the same time period to shame, you quickly realize its shortcomings on the wrist, including the fact that you can't remove enough links on the 6 o'clock side to accommodate a smaller wrist. This places the buckle way off center. You might also question whether it was laziness on the part of Rolex to just add a red hand to a Submariner and call it a whole new watch, but alas, over the past 7 decades, the watch has carved out a universe all to itself. With its illustrious history, playful colors, and durability, it's no wonder that these are some of the most coveted models on the vintage market. So one of the problems with a watch that's appreciated so much in value is that it becomes kind of impractical to wear. Especially on a vintage watch that might feel a little delicate, you're constantly aware of this thing on your wrist. Now, I wear my watches on my left hand, which is my non-dominant side. If I now have to be extra cautious of it, this hand is going to be useless soon. So along with the GMT Master, I brought a modern rendition of the PEPSI GMT. Now, before we take a look at the Tudor, please take a second, go down and just drop a like for this video. Also, consider subscribing if you want to stay up to date with future content. Thank you. The Tudor Black Bay GMT may seem like an oddball choice here, and you might ask, why not do the comparison with a modern 6-digit GMT Master from Rolex? Well, first of all, I don't have one of those, and second, though a modern watch, this Tudor actually has design elements that are much more vintage inspired than you might think. For example, it also features an aluminum bezel with the same PEPSI colors, reminding us of what the Rolex might have looked like right out of the box. Compared with other Black Bays, the lume plots are also smaller, just like the vintage Rolex, making the dial less in your face than a Black Bay 58. But what really stands out is the use of these snowflake square shapes, so quintessentially Tudor, especially that distinct long GMT hand stretching all the way to the edge of the dial, making the pop of red more legible at a glance. Whichever PEPSI you choose though, their playful colors are like candy on the wrist, catching your eye and probably the eyes of those around you as you go about your day. This is not a watch that you wear to easily blend into many outfits, but rather a statement piece of your discerning taste as a collector. Being a modern watch, the in-house MT5652 movement has an independent jump hour function, allowing you to move the hour hand without having to reset the entire watch. However, a drawback of this is the elimination of the quick set date function, necessitating 2 full rotations of the hour hand for each date advance. Unfortunately, my verdict on the Tudor came rather quickly once I put it on my wrist. The case is intolerably thick at 15mm, and this along with a 50mm lug to lug and a 22mm lug width makes the watch feel heavy and wobbly. And I would imagine most people on the slender side of Jason Momoa would agree with me. This is a shame because if Tudor was able to house this watch in a Black Bay 58 case, it would be a perfect modern take on the vintage Rolex. The use of a matte dial, that two-tone bezel, and the albeit controversial riveted bracelet would allow you to get that vintage feel without the fear of scratching up a time capsule. Unfortunately, as it stands, the Tudor Black Bay GMT for me remains a watch that looks better on Instagram pictures than on my wrist. So that's the dilemma, isn't it? The Tudor feels so much more robust, but the reason I prefer the vintage GMT is because it feels more delicate and alive. I just wish you could pause the aging process exactly where it is right now, but that's like asking for Val Kilmer to always be Iceman. It's just not going to happen. So if money was no object, I would get the vintage GMT Master and just wear the hell out of it. But as the way that prices are, I think it would stay a watch box queen, and I really think we ought to wear our watches. Anyways, what do you think? Do you have a great GMT Master story, or would you save your money and just get the Tudor? Let me know in the comments below. So thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.